Welcome again to Educator. Now that you've actually finished two short stories and you got a lot of vocabulary under your belt, let's continue on with settings and themes in literature. So, for the lesson overview, we're going to be doing three things. We're going to be talking about what is a setting. And it turns out a setting is a little bit more than what you might think it is. Then I'm going to give you examples of themes, and then what is a theme, and then we're going to spend the rest of the lesson learning how to recognize certain important themes in stories. So, let's go start right at the beginning. What's a setting? Well, a setting answers two questions. Where does a story take place? And when does a story take place? Those are the two basic questions for a story. So, in our short stories with the Veld, the story takes place in the happy life home sometime in the future. In The Most Dangerous Game, the story takes place on an isolated island sometime in the early 1930s or late 1920s. But there are other questions that we have to ask about setting. Those two are important, but they're not enough. And here's why. Let's think about the social conditions of a story. Here's a quick example. If I wrote a story about the 1860s, well, that's when, and I said it's in the South, that's where, that's not sufficient for a setting, is it? Because if I told the story about, well, a family of slaves like in Roots, that's not going to be the same story as the story about a group of Southern aristocrats, and that in turn will not be the same setting as a group of soldiers fighting the Union. All 1, 2, and 3 here have dramatically different social conditions and thus a different setting, even though they take place in the same place and in the same time. So, let's go back to our stories. The Veld, what are the social conditions? Well, if they own a house that in today's dollars was worth about $300,000, I'd say that they're probably upper middle class. Also, I'd say that they're like a nuclear family, which is just like the ideal in Leave It to Beaver. I mean, you have two parents living at home, you have two kids, you probably have a white picket fence, maybe you're playing basketball. They didn't have a dog. I don't know why they don't have a dog, but they're trying to very much be the nuclear family. Now, I leave it to you, the reader, to judge whether they're successful at that, but you get the idea. Also, this story assumes certain things about gender roles. Now, gender just means are you a man or a woman or a boy or a girl or, well, I could go on, but I won't. There's certain assumptions made about, well, what's a gender role? And you can kind of read through that story and figure out what that might be. Dangerous Game. What are the social conditions here? Well, they might be far out from civilization, but they're still very wealthy safari gentlemen who know how to treat each other and know how to introduce themselves and give each other cocktails and nice food and compliments and talk about how great it is to be a hunter. General Zaroff gives orders. There's a military society going on here. Finally, I'd say that probably both these individuals, but especially General Zaroff, are both very powerful people. And so those are the social conditions in The Most Dangerous Game. I mean, imagine how different the story would have been if the story had been about the previous people who crashed on the island, just a group of random poor sailors. That would be a very different story, because the social conditions would have been different. So, when we're asking about social conditions, and thus a setting, here are a couple things that you might ask yourself. What is the nationality of the characters here? What's their ethnicity? Finally, what's their social and economic status? I mean, are they rich people or are they poor people? Are they aristocrats or are they plebeians? Who knows? More broadly speaking, we might ask, what type of government do they live under? That could affect the story. I mean, after all, a story about, America in 1776 is going to be a lot different than, the colonies in the year 1700. Might be important to understand what are the religious values of, certain characters in the story. Most importantly, values, goals, and ideals. These are shared by all kinds of people. I mean, everybody wants to be happy, and sometimes all people want to be happy by becoming rock stars. if I have a story about all people who want to be rock stars, then that value and that goal affects the setting of the story. Now, you might be asking yourself here, well, I don't really care about the religion of George Hadley and the Veldt, and I'm not so sure I care about the government and The Most Dangerous Game. Well, that's true. You're not going to answer all these questions all the time, but these are just a few sample questions that can be thrown out there that would help you determine the setting. Chances are, whatever's most important, the author is going to give you right away in Act 1 of the story. Now, we understand settings, let's move on to theme. And I'm going to give you some examples of themes, and then I'll tell you what a theme is. There was a great movie called The Village by M. Night Shyamalan that came out a few years ago. And in The Village, people live in a tiny village surrounded by a forest that they're scared of. Every night, they go out to the border of their town and to the border of the village in yellow robes, and they paint yellow paint on fence posts to keep out those who we do not speak of. And they live very, very peacefully, but they are terrified to go out into the woods. We learn later they're also terrified to go out to the cities because they just think the cities are evil. What is the theme here? Give you a clue. This color right here, it symbolizes fear. And thus, I'd say the theme, or one of the themes in The Village, is fear. How about something else? How about The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien? Well, lots of themes here, but let me narrow it down to one. Frodo and his band are taking the ring to Mordor. After a fight with Boromir, Frodo decides to go away on his own. This burden is too much to share. I don't want to hurt my friends. I'm going to take this all on my own. But Samwise, his best friend, doesn't let him go alone, and they continue on together. Later in the stories we learn that Frodo wouldn't have made it very far without Sam. The theme here is friendship. And how about a great example from television? Some of you might have seen that show Lost. It's on Netflix. But here's what happens. A plane crashes on an island and there are only 42 survivors. They argue, they scramble, and they fight for survival. You know, hey man, I want the fresh water. No, I need the shoes. No, I need the books. No, I need that for my shelter. Me, 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 me. And they argue and they fight. But finally, one character stands up and he gives a very, very important speech and ends with a memorable quote. We must live together or die alone. There's no rescue coming, folks. So, Lost actually has a lot of themes, but one of them is survival. But additionally, one of the common themes is forming a social contract. If you don't remember what a social contract is, think back to 8th grade civics. People don't know how to live together. We have a lot of freedmen do stuff. But in order to live together and to survive, one person agrees, okay, I'll stop doing this if you stop doing this. We'll agree that we'll trade instead of constantly steal from each other. That's an example of a social contract. Now, when we think about themes, they're not always attached to one story. Here's an example of some themes about survival that aren't from the show of Lost. We could tell a story about a plane that crashes in Alaska during the summer. Hey, it's warmer than winter, but the survivors still need food and shelter. How are they going to live? Or maybe I want to tell a story that's kind of like The Most Dangerous Game. And I have a group of 16th century sailors that are shipwrecked on an island with unfriendly natives. How are they going to live? There's also maybe some stories you've read. Maybe you've read the book Hatchet or My Side of the Mountain. These are also stories that have the theme of survival. So finally, what do I mean when I say theme? Well, what is the moral of the story? Maybe you remember Aesop's fables, or maybe you read the parables from the Gospels, and somebody said, all right, kids, what's the moral of the story? That's an example of a theme. A theme is also something that addresses a broader and universal idea. So the idea of survival against adversity is shown up in my story about an Alaskan plane crash or shipwrecked sailors in the 16th century and the TV show Lost. It's not just about those TV shows anymore, it's about something outside of those TV shows. A theme is a way that the author dramatizes a message or feeling that the author wants you to understand. Imagine if I said to you this: jaguars have feelings too. Well, that'd be kind of boring. I probably wouldn't be very persuasive. But imagine if I dramatized a story about a human being hunted just like a jaguar, and I made you feel the fear that that human being feels as they're trying to survive. And I said, that's what a jaguar feels. That's a great way to dramatize a message. Make you feel it. Now, how do we recognize a theme? Well, first, let's talk about the opening of The Most Dangerous Game. Expositions and preludes right at the beginning in Act 1 will usually give us a clue. So what did the characters talk about? Well, they were talking about jaguars, and they were talking about being a hunter and hunters and hunties, and whether animals have feelings, and, who's this sport really fun for? Let's go to another famous story called Romeo and Juliet. In fair Verona we lay our scene. Where? Well, it's in Verona. From ancient grudge to break new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean, where from the fatal loins of two foes, two star-crossed lovers take their life. Now, if you've never read Shakespeare, that's a little difficult, so I'll translate it to you. In the city of Verona is where our story begins. From an old grudge between two families, people keep on fighting, and the blood of non-soldiers makes people's hands very dirty. But from the daughter and the son of these two families are star-crossed, and they're never meant to be together, and they take their life. Okay, so just from that exposition, and you can read the whole exposition or watch the YouTube video, the 90s version. It's basically talking about two feuding families and two lovers who aren't meant to be together. That's the theme. Another way to recognize a theme is recurring symbols. So think about the ring in Lord of the Rings. What does that symbolize? Well, it symbolizes power, corruption, evil, and temptation. How about the Harry Potter series? We got the Gryffindor lion. And what do lions usually symbolize? Well, things like courage, bravery. If you maybe read John Granger, you'll find out what else it symbolizes. Or maybe we could go back to the Veldt and we can kind of assign our own symbol. The nursery in the Veldt. What does it symbolize? Another great way to recognize a theme is we have to explore character relationships. We have to explore their roles, their backstory, and their traits. I mean, chances are, if I was to tell you a story from the perspective of somebody who's severely addicted to drugs, well, guess what? My theme is probably going to be addiction. But here's a couple examples. Harry Potter, Severus Snape, and Voldemort all had similar pasts. I mean, they were all kind of orphan kids when you think about it. And so, well, that's part of the theme in Harry Potter. In The Most Dangerous Game, well, what do the protagonist and the antagonist have in common? Well, if you've read that, you already know, and that's part of the theme of the story. Finally, in the Veldt, we got how do these kids react after the locking of the nursery? What might that say about them? And how does it affect the theme? What do you think one of the important themes is in the Veldt and The Most Dangerous Game? So, finally, an important way that we can recognize a theme is actually just go back and look at the setting. In the television show Lost, we have people are struck on an island, and that gives us a huge clue as to what some of the themes might be. In the Veldt, we have the ideal 1950s style family that's presented in kind of a different way, in a way that's not perfect and not super happy. I mean, that is not Leave It to Beaver. So what does that say about the theme of the Veldt? So, themes and stories so far, here's what I'd give you. I'd say that one of the themes of the Welt is the idealized nuclear family. I'd say one of the themes is also actually addiction, and probably also parenting. And The Most Dangerous Game, I might say that this is actually a story about animal rights. Believe me, somebody could argue that. It's also a story about the very bored and the very idle rich. I mean, General Zaroff is just there smoking his cigars, drinking his cocktails. He doesn't have to have a cafe. He doesn't have to run a taxi. I'm bored. Time to hunt somebody. And maybe in The Most Dangerous Game, there's also this big question about what does it really mean to be civilized? So your assignment is to actually go and read another story. Go and read Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell. Pay attention to the setting and see if you can find a theme. Answer the short questions. Discuss with friends. I don't mind if you do it together. And your vocabulary exercises. Also, if you still got that art pad and that pen, don't be afraid to draw a scene from Shooting an Elephant if that helps you understand it, or if it's just fun. Till then, we're going to be continuing on with our next lesson. But take a break here and finish the assignment. Thanks for using Educator.